I think some of the issues that we've seen politically, et cetera, is that we are equating fact and truth. I don't believe that they're the same. The more explicit the argument, the more persuasive the argument is perceived to be. Every decision that we have has a story behind it. Our point of view is the only truly unique thing that we have. Meaning how all of these beliefs and experiences and feelings and whatever come together is 100% unique. One of the things that really helped me get past my panic disorder was a technique that I developed in the moment, which was based on a logical piece of information, where I read that you cannot be physically relaxed and mentally anxious at the same time. So any moment where I was starting to feel like panic coming up, I would literally like physically relax every part of my body to have that happen.
Ever wonder why some ideas catch fire and others fizzle out? Well, today we're joined by Tamsen Webster. After 20 years as a professional speaker, Tamsen has developed a great expertise in the ability of why messages work. Part English to English translator, part now, I believe, Ivy League doctoral student.
Yes.
Congratulations
Thank
on that.
you.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Tamsen has mastered the art and the science of what makes audiences not just listen, but also act. Now, as founder of the Message Design Institute, Tamsen is also the author of two brilliant books, Say What They Can't Unhear, and also Finding Your Red Thread. And in both of these books, Tamsen looks at the power of messaging and what we need to do to ensure our messages lead directly to powerful, compelling action. Tamsen has a lot of experience in terms of crafting messages. She worked with TEDx on helping people to be able to master the art and helping speakers and leaders and authors and experts to master the art of distilling down their concepts and ideas into something meaningful that actually drives action and gets the kind of results. She's worked with Fortune 10 executives, she's worked with Ivy League deans, and she's also worked with entrepreneurs to ensure that they're able to make sure their messages are not just heard, but acted upon. I'm delighted, obviously, because given the belief leadership stuff and the inner propaganda stuff that many of you know about, I am fascinated with this area. Myself and Tamsen's work has overlapped. I've heard about Tamsen from a number of my colleagues. I've read her books. I've seen her in action, and she's a phenomenal force for the better. And I'm very excited to nerd out. So without any further ado, welcome, Tamsen.
Thank you. And let the nerding out begin.
Fantastic.
Yay.
So I want to start with, so you've written two books.
I have.
Finding Your Red Thread
Yep.
is a book that you wrote primarily to be able to help a lot of people find their own red thread. Could you explain a little bit about what you mean by red thread?
Yep.
And what are the kinds of challenges or problems that you solve for who with this book?
Sure. So what I mean by red thread, it's borrowing from a Northern European idiom, meaning what is the logical progression of ideas? And idiomatically, people use it to say, well, what's the big idea here? And given the nature of my work, that's often the thing that people really struggle with. Not only what is the idea, but what is the thing that is so powerful about that idea that other people can see it too. And the approach that I took was a little bit what we were talking about before we started recording. I was looking for some kind of universal decoder ring or Rosetta Stone for understanding ideas. And it doesn't take much scratching of the surface to realize that story is a beautiful way to do that. We're wired for stories, Lisa Cron would say, and it's how we make sense of everything, even unconsciously. So the red thread was about how to reverse engineer any idea back into the story that you told yourself or sold yourself about why it was the right idea to do X, Y, or Z. So that, because it's now in that format, it was automatically more interesting and more understandable to anybody else. So my hope for that book was really specifically for those people who knew they had a really strong idea, though you can use it to find an idea as well, but really weren't sure why it wasn't getting traction with people, or they knew and were aware of the fact that they could see the power, but other people couldn't. So typically, when I'm using the red thread with somebody, we've already really figured out what that underlying idea is. And now we're trying to maximize the understanding and the engagement, the interest for somebody else. So using it with typically content of some sort. How do you structure conversation? How do you plan a talk or a keynote? How do you structure a book even based on those things? But really its power, I think, is in getting at those elements of story that we often leave out and yet are critical for understanding and agreement, and therefore any kind of action.
The problem is we are drowning in a world of ideas,
Yes,
right? There's
yeah.
lots of information.
Yep.
Everyone's lots of information. So being able to make it so that someone's able to articulate themselves in such a way that people want to hear more.
Yes.
Could you talk us through a little bit about what is it that makes what you do work? What is it makes the ideas stand out so powerfully?
Well, I think one of the main elements is what I was saying before, is that and I think you know and get this with the work that you do, is that there is the surface level information we need to hear in order to understand an idea and see whether or not we align with it. But actually, it's some of the deeper stuff that really determines whether or not an idea makes sense for us. So, for instance, if we think about the work of Simon Sinek and Find Your Why, that was really important, as much as some folks might go, yeah, obviously you need to understand why you're doing something. It wasn't obvious to a lot of people that there needs to be if you do this, then, or we're doing this because. But even this is where I would pull in Machiavelli, where he classically said the end justifies the means. And that is true if and only if you and the other person you're talking to agree on the ends. It's true if and only if you agree on that justification part that we don't pay nearly enough attention to. And therefore, maybe then we'll agree on the means. And so what I mean by that is the red thread pulls apart and makes sure that all of those key pieces are there. And what those pieces are, kind of linking it back to what some of the other things you're talking to, are all the different ways that we sustain interest and the decision to move forward with our understanding or an engagement with the idea. And that goal question, for instance, is, I have this conversation a lot with my clients. They're like, well, what about an engaging hook or some kind of thing? And I'm like, you could do that. But an open question that somebody's currently asking right now creates a drive state in anybody, meaning it creates a gap that they want to close. So if you can name a question that somebody has, if you can name something that they want and don't yet have, don't have a good answer for it, don't have a satisfactory answer for it, and say, everything I'm about to tell you is about either how to achieve this thing or how someone else achieved this thing. If that's a thing that they want, boom, they're already going to be engaged. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't be even better with some other kind of hook in that, but that's part of it. Then there's that. So that's the first piece where you have to get understanding, you have to agreement. And then the next thing is they have to understand how it is fundamentally different than what they are doing now or pursuing now. And that's where, from a storytelling standpoint, we're introducing a problem that people don't know they have. It's most people think X, but actually Y. And that is important in order to create that contrast. But again, in order for someone to move forward, they not only have to agree that that's a valid alternative view, and this is where some of that deeper kind of assumptions and belief come into play. But you also have to do that without triggering any of their reactants, without them feeling, in most situations, like you are somehow implying that they are wrong, stupid, incapable, incompetent, or whatever for not knowing that already. So we have to kind of get to that point where they're like, yeah, I agree that, there's a lot of barriers in the way, but I have been focusing on this kind of conventional answer more than this one. And based on this belief that we share, I now see why that creates a problem, because it is not going, there's just something about the nature of that focus that's going to keep me from getting the thing that I want. And then, right, so that may disrupt our status quo. So that's part of why it needs to be there. We need to say why we can't stay where we were. And again, I don't think it has to be pain leveraged. I think, and I would imagine, I'm curious what you think based on your work. I think cognitive dissonance is enough pain to get people to move. So getting cognitive dissonance that says, oh, if I really want that and I've only been looking at this one thing, then I can't get there. So for instance, if we're talking about ideas, if you really want to get buy-in for ideas and you understand that every decision that we have has a story behind it, if you are just either telling somebody what to do, no story, or you are leaving elements out of the story, then you are likely not going to be able to get the thing that you're looking for. So that's like, oh, okay. But to understand and really feel and keep that forward motion going, we have to then go from a storytelling perspective into a place that, from what I can see, almost every other attempt to capture story structure other than like the actual hero's journey skips what I think is one of the most important next steps. And that's the moment of truth. Aristotle called it the anagnorisis, still one of my favorite words. But it means recognition, and it's the moment where you recognize the true nature of your circumstances. And we were talking before we started recording about our love of movies and things like that. And any screenwriter knows this moment very well. I was talking to my sister, a screenwriter, and she's like, oh yeah, of course, that's the penny drop moment. And I remember when I was doing this work, I'm like, well, what is the penny that drops? And she's like, does that have a name? And she's like, no, nobody's ever named the penny. And I'm like, oh, like, so, but it's in that moment where Luke realizes or is told that Darth's his father. Like Darth Vader, sorry if that's a spoiler.
If it's a spoiler, shame on you.
Exactly. But it's that moment where you were like, oh, I actually do know, like, given everything that's happening, if I still want this, if I like can't go back, and because this other thing is true, I actually know what my options are. And that leads us to that fourth piece, which is that what I call the change, but it's really the conclusion of the argument that says, I know what to do now. I know how to proceed. And then it's really just all wrapping it up from there. So back to your question about what do I think is different or special, or what is that, I think to me, it is a continued opening and closing, opening and closing, opening and closing of those curiosity gaps, and a continued securing of understanding and agreement, which is essentially permission to go forward.
So to me, I have a bunch of things to say. Sorry,
Yes.
you stimulated about 900 thoughts here, so I'm going to get at least 3 of them out.
Okay.
Just to first of all understand.
Yep.
So I think one of the things that occurs to me as you were explaining that is, number one, when we get a one-liner, right? Some of these great techniques I shared earlier by our colleagues, they're brilliant and they grab attention and they get people to want to ask more. What you're talking more about is deeply exploring the idea. So it's not only catchy on the outside, which might be the through line, but actually there's a significant depth where it's all coherent and organized well.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Second thing is, based upon the penny drop moment in movies, a lot of times I spend a lot of time attending workshops of a screenwriting teacher who your sister would be very familiar with, known as Bob McKee.
Yeah, of course.
And I've become friends with Bob, and he's been on the podcast as well. He's a phenomenal mind. But when he talks about the various different elements of it, one of the things I learned is that a lot of times we go through moments of revelation and moments of reversal.
Yes.
So reversal is when you think it's going one way, it goes another way. Yep. So we go from a positive turning point to a negative turning point. Yep. And then this other revelation is when it's revealed that Luke happens to have a father, like Darth Vader is the father. Yep. And again, that's a turning point, not based upon the action, but based upon the realization.
Yes.
And I think that when you have that penny dropping moment in, for example, the change, because that's right after the truth, there's also the contrast element there.
Yep.
The third thing that I wanted to mention was, I would love us to walk through just spontaneously now we'll take Simon Sinek's one, because I think it's pretty straightforward, simple. And I'm going to try to tackle it, and I want you to correct me and suggest it. So if we take the goal is pretty much in the title of his TED Talk.
Yes.
What great leaders do to inspire action. That's the goal. I want to know what great leaders do to inspire action. The problem is that a lot of leaders don't inspire action and don't know how to inspire action.
So, So...
or they focus on what to do it, but
so one of the things that's important is, I would say those turning points that McKee talks about are always revelations of some kinds or realizations of some kind. And so, which means by definition, in my mind, the problem that gets introduced cannot be the problem that's in that goal question, because they already know that's a problem. So it's not going to be a realization to be like, oh, by the way, like if you're asking if you want to know how to inspire action, at some point either you are already admitting that you don't know how to do that, or you don't know how to do it well. And so to say, hey, you're not inspiring action wouldn't actually be valid. But Simon does talk about it, because he typically, if we think about his golden circle, where why is in the middle, and I think it's why.
How, what, yeah.
Why, okay. What he basically says is most of the time, here's the problem pair, we focus on what we do more than on why we do it. And he essentially says that's a problem because people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And so what he does there is that line I would call, depending on like which format I'm talking about, that is one of those underlying assumptions of his point of view that he is making explicit. If I ever write a second edition of the Red Thread, I'll add it to it, where I would call it the problem principle. It's the thing that cements that contrast as irreversibly, like you have to now pay attention to it. Because if you want to drive action and you agree either intuitively or with the evidence that he provides that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it, and you agree you've been mostly focusing on talking about what to do rather than why, again, your brain is going to go, oh, nuts. Right?
And then when you go into, let's say, for example, the truth.
Yep.
Is the truth then, so again, it's goal, problem, truth, change, action. So in the truth, is the truth then, well, actually, the Wrights brothers, Apple, they all start with why. Like why is what inspires people. Look at all these examples of why is what inspires people. Is that the truth or not?
Almost. So what I would say is you are providing evidence, right, of the truth. And I would articulate, so this is an important and subtle thing, and frankly something I didn't really figure out until after Red Thread was published and I started to work on the next line of thought. And that is that if you just focus on why, it doesn't tell you where in that, right? And so he's not. So the other piece of it, there's a truth, which I would have to look at the transcript to see if he says anything in particular about why you have to start there. I think he kind of skips the truth. He gives you evidence of the truth, that there's something about starting with why that does something. Like he doesn't, for instance, I mean, I have my own suspicion about why starting with why is important. I think it's because it creates an initial alignment on those ends. And if you're not aligned on the ends, then it's really hard to understand, like, then what it is doesn't actually matter.
And I think just to add to that, I think it also has, again, this is just my take on it, there's also a motivation piece there.
Yeah.
Why elicits motivation.
Yes.
And so when you give people the reason why, then immediately you're linking into the whole pain and pleasure.
Yeah, exactly. And you're painting a picture of what's possible and yeah, exactly. Kind of activating that optimism bias a lot of times, or the other. And so I would say the truth is, there's something about the truth that I believe goes unarticulated, though it doesn't go unsupported, that is about, it's not just about focusing on why. We actually have to start, if you're trying to inspire action, you have to start with something that inspires action. Right? Whether that's the motivation, whether that's a aligned ends or something. And I think it's a great example actually of how sometimes these principles that represent the truth and that really could tie that problem together are sometimes feel so obvious that they don't feel necessary to put out there. And yet, if we're looking at, here comes the nerding. If we're looking at classic forms of argumentation, which fundamentally a story is an argument, and so that's actually what started this newer line of thinking. I was like, what if that's literally true? Turns out it is. In classic argument, there is that not the evidence, but the principle is what's known as a warrant. It's the thing that connects logically the thing that you're saying to, like, why it makes sense. So why do you start with why? Well, because there's this thing about why that does that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And you need to start with something. Starting with something that drives action is more likely to drive action, is the unspoken, implicit warrant for why you would start there. Let me back up. Also, in the research, is that the more explicit the argument, the more persuasive the argument is perceived to be, first of all. Second, you're also leaving much, much, much less up to inference for someone to kind of figure out what you mean by that. Now, sometimes the evidence presented is enough. If you're like, well, Apple starts with why, and these people start with why, and Martin Luther King started with why, then I should start with why too. My hesitation, particularly if I'm working with a client who, this is, if their whole business is behind this idea, like you can't find, we don't want to find any cracks in that support for it.
Sorry to interrupt, but plus there's also the possibility that the pattern that you're kind of assuming is true is not necessarily the pattern that they notice.
Correct. Right. Which is why I am so banging the drum these days about saying the quiet part out loud. Like, even if it feels obvious to you, thanks to things like the false consensus effect and all sorts of other things where we believe everybody sees the world the way that we do, and we're totally surprised when we discover that they don't. Maybe they do. And at this way, you're just at least like double checking. You're just like, well, wouldn't it make sense to, like, if you want to drive action, to start with something that is likely to drive action? Yeah. Okay. Well, what is that thing? It's why. Well, why would you start with why? Because people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So therefore, start with that. Like, that's the argument that he's making. So that's the change, would be start with why. That is, in fact, what he's telling people to do. And then he says,
the golden circle is the how.
Yeah.
For me, and I think it's also especially important in this day and age, what you said about the sort of implicit assumptions that we make, because I think nowadays the polarization that's, let's say, dividing in many ways or impacting society in a large amount of ways, a big part of it is there's that false consensus effect where we believe other people must see the world the way we do. And then all of a sudden they don't. In fact, they see it the opposite. In fact, we now have facts which we disagree on. Yeah. And if you're disagreeing on the premise, you can't really have an argument. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of times debates fall flat, arguments fall flat, because if you don't even agree on the premises, you can't have a proper argument.
That's right. And this is why, by the way, I think that some stories resonate and some stories don't. Mm-hmm. Because when we're telling a story, even if we're just following the structure of a story, those things are kind of automatically popped in there as long as you hit those major turning points, which is why I started with the red thread, because it was a way to kind of back people into some of this thinking without actually asking them to go right for it, right? It's hard for people to think about these big abstract concepts out of the gate. And sometimes it's easier for them to think about it in that narrative structure because that's actually how they figured it out for themselves. And yet, right, in order to make sure that we've got that alignment, we have to put a name on it in order to pull it back out to see where we are. And what I find actually very hopeful in that is that there is a quite large band of assumptions and beliefs that we actually do all agree on. And I think that the power of being able to explain an idea or argue for an idea using that kind of band of beliefs is a very hopeful thing. The thing that I wrestle with and I struggle with is, how do we keep the focus on mutual understanding and not manipulation? Because that's very important to my point of view in the world. I spend a lot of time examining how people misuse some of these tools so that I try very hard to build into the things that I do to make it very hard to use them for ill. Doesn't mean they can't be, but I try.
But I think one of the big issues or big challenges is that oftentimes we're not incentivized for the truth.
I know.
We're incentivized for attention. We're incentivized for conviction. Yes. We're incentivized for, hype, because that's ultimately what drives attention. Let's just stay in this area if we don't mind. And we're not going to, it's not about going political or whatever, but I would like to talk about So Stephen Colbert famously talked about the concept of truthiness.
Yes.
We have the concept of fake news, which obviously has been around for a few hundred years, but at
Yeah.
the same time has a resurgence over the last while. You also have a proliferation of different forms of propaganda. A few years ago, I visited North Korea, and when I came back from there, I was asked the question, I must have been crazy there with propaganda. Now, this is back before 2016. And they said it must have been crazy. And I said, well, the difference between North Korea and America, and obviously I was, being glib, but the difference between North Korea and America is North Korea has one point of view. America has two, right? And I don't mean that because there's millions of people that have a more subtle, more in the gray perspective of it. But especially nowadays, it's almost like you're either with us or against us. You have the Democrats, you have the Republicans, you have the conservatives, you have the liberals. From my point of view, and this is where I'm getting it to, I'd love to explore this concept of truth because
Yes.
there's a wonderful book that I read recently, The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself, or something along those lines. And in the book, the author talks about the notion of truth. And she says, look, there's two kind of notions of truth. There's the truth that we believe, which is either true or false. And that's kind of the truth that we talk about today.
Yeah.
But there's the ancient form of truth, which was popularized around the time of the Sophists, where they talked about truth as being, it's true if it's seen, and if it's unseen or hidden, that's the opposite to truth. So as opposed to true versus false, it's true versus hidden.
Interesting.
And what she talked about was the sophist would be showing you something that you hadn't seen before. And that would be revealing the truth to you. So if you think of Plato's cave, as opposed to we live in this cave, we're living in a cave of falsehoods, the shadows on the wall are reality, and then we go out and we see the real world.
Yep.
What they're sort of pointing at is that, education, where you lead the person out, you're just showing them what is there. You're not necessarily showing them that what they already experienced was false. Now, the idea, and again, I'll just bring it back because I'd love to hear your perspective on it, but the idea then is that when truth is something like that, it means that somebody who speaks extemporaneously or spontaneously can feel true to us because of that ancient sort of wiring we have.
Yeah.
Whereas necessarily it's less so about the facts, because at the end of the day, you even have scientists that are able to, because of what they want. I mean, I've read so many studies that told me that chocolate and wine are really good for me, right? Like, you have the corporate...
I choose to continue to believe the
correct.
Chocolate one.
That's it. I agree with it, right? Watching Star Wars makes you smarter. Great. But the point of it is that for me, I think it's a really interesting question, because we don't want to fall into the, nihilistic element of epistemology where we're talking about no one knows what's true and it's all subjective, but at the same time there's something there about authenticity or speaking off the cuff tends to make it feel more true, because you're not planning this speech, you're not trying to love to hear your thoughts on that.
So the first thing that reminds me of is that there was research, I haven't myself located this, but it comes from somebody who quotes research responsibly, where they did research on presenters using a flip chart and live drawing things versus slides, and how the perceived credibility of that speaker goes way up if you are actually using a flip chart versus slides, for very much the same reason. Because there's this belief that it must come from a deeper place of knowing and believing if you don't have to rely on something prepared in order for you to do this.
What if nobody can read your writing? Does that still work?
I regularly do this because I'm like, it's impressionistic at best, but I usually try to stay mostly for visuals rather than words.
There is research, though, to suggest that when people have to actually use a lot more cognitive resources to figure out what you're... Like when you write poorly and they have to go, what does that say? They're actually more likely to remember it as a result.
Gosh.
So if you're a poor writer, like I certainly am, then, you win.
Well, that would align with other research that talks about we value more what we have struggled to gain.
That's
right. And so,
that's right. Make it hard.
It's all connected in my mind. Okay. So I am deeply interested in this concept of truth for any number of reasons. So I'm trying to figure out, similar to you, I'm just going to give an array of the things that are in my head. First of all, people found it really resonant a few weeks ago when, even though it was something I talked about in my newer book, I did a little video on the difference between you're right, that's right, and that's true. So the you're right, that's right dichotomy, that comes from Chris Voss and Never Split the Difference. And he's talking about how you're right or that's right are the two sweetest words in the English language, because it means that somebody agrees, right, that something is true, or that they agree with you, period. And he says that that's a better goal in negotiations and life, et cetera, than you're right, because you're right could just be like, yeah, stop talking, I'm not interested. But that's right is an acknowledgement that something is there. I would suggest, based on the work and the research that I've done, that when somebody says that's true, that taps a much, much deeper source of, from the adult learning standpoint, validity, right? Like that something is valid all the way down is one way to think about it. And a lot of the adult learning literature talks about, I'm curious from the psychological standpoint how this matches up too, is that for us to truly know something, it has to be something that everything about how we think about it aligns. And so that moment where someone says that's true is I think this it's this unification of rational, intuitive, emotional, affective, all of this happening at one time. The third thing that came to mind as you were talking about it is that, again, since I'm deeply steeped in my doctoral program right now and doing things like research methods and fun stuff like that your mother would appreciate, I hope, is that it actually reminds me of, that dichotomy that you're talking about truth as being true, not true, or truth versus hidden. It also reminds me of this progression that happened and is still present in the sciences about that very debate, right? So that physical sciences very much started with true, not true, verifiable, not verifiable. And even the verifiable, not verifiable is a slide over from positivism to post-positivism. And then you get people who say, well, who says it's true? Right? Because that's where you start to get into critical theory, not go into the political stuff, but that's what critical theory is, just basically saying who is defining truth, to the constructivists that are starting to say, and this is where it starts to get messy and the meaning is what we create of it and whatever, to frankly where I am, and there's nothing better about these. It's just how the things evolved, which is based on my own experience and what I've observed to be true. There's this kind of the newest way of thinking about this is what's known as enactivism. You probably know that, which is that kind of in the moment, how you understand something is the product of kind of all of it, right? Mm-hmm. The environment, your cognition, your affect, like how you're feeling about something, what your beliefs are, what your truths are, which I think allows for, in certain moments, I actually think that what's usually presented linearly actually starts to wrap around back again, because I think that like you and I would agree that there's something solid sitting in front of us that we are agreeing in the moment we're going to call it a table.
Sure.
And that we have to, at those various moments, agree on certain things to be true in order for us just to be able to function.
Sure.
And so this is where, when it comes to this idea of truth and truthiness and those kinds of things, this is, again, why I keep coming back to the potential value in making these previously implicit, unuttered, unexamined assumptions explicit for people, so that we can check our shared definitions of truth kind of at every stage. And since I do so much work with business leaders, how can we get to that quickly so we can understand where those gaps are and address them from a truth level, which is different than a fact level, sure, as quickly as possible? And to me, that's I think some of the issues that we've seen politically, et cetera, is that we are equating fact and truth. And they're not, I don't believe they're the same.
Sure.
And so everyone's always talking about alternative facts. Well, okay, but I think that if you look at a different group of facts, you're going to arrive at a different truth. Like that's
sure,
kind of classic ladder of inference stuff.
So first of all, the book that I was trying to articulate, it's The Ancient Art of Thinking Clearly by Robin Reams. That's the
lovely.
name of,
okay.
Yeah, so that's she's written a bunch of books on rhetoric, so she's terrific.
Rhetoric is so fun.
It is. The second thing is when you talk about, it has to sort of It has to feel true, from an affect point of view. There's a number of things going on. There's a neuroscientist called Robert Burton, and he wrote a book, I think, called On Being Certain. And he basically defines belief as a feeling of knowing.
Oh, yeah.
And that notion of feeling of knowing, what you mentioned there, the affective realism, as Lisa Feldman Barrett calls it,
Yeah.
this notion of we see the world based on how we feel, that becomes our truth or
Yep.
an emotional reality. And it mixes with the stories we tell ourselves, which bring the arguments and the logic, and all of that mixes, including what we want to believe at that moment in time.
Absolutely.
So that's our truth. Then we have the facts, to your point. And once again, what's a fact? Well, it depends on who you're asking, because once again, facts have to be, to a degree, in order for them to be facts, agreed upon or stated, this is a fact, and then we just disagree about what is and isn't a fact.
Right.
What I'm really interested in is when we try to, I think getting into this whole nature of not just motivated reasoning, but our phenomenal ability as human beings to rationalize.
Yeah.
There's that quote, man is not a rational animal, it's a rationalizing animal, right?
Yep.
Our creature.
Festinger,
And it's this idea that we tend to be really good at being able to show why our, like, as you put it, our intuitions are, as Danny Kahneman would say, our system one, assumptions, why they're true.
Yep.
When you think about, because this is where I'm getting back to, again, how we bridge this gap from a polarization perspective. I think a big part of it comes down to the stuff, and you mentioned this in Say What They Can't Unhear as well, which I think is huge. It's that identity is the most important thing in many ways.
Yeah.
And so, especially in the research out there shows that when it's anything to do with political or cultural, anything to do with our identity, it's like hardcore, even they've shown the brain in terms of the amygdala has a much stronger response whenever our identities are threatened.
Yep.
From your perspective, if you're talking to someone or you're trying to bridge the gap between people, and in your mind, because I'm sure you, like, similar to me, Tamsen, you have your opinions, you have your beliefs, you have your convictions, you have a political perspective or point of view, and other people have a very different point of view, but you're also an expert in terms of message design or persuasion. And I find myself doing this, is that I know where I'm biased. I know where I have a point of view that is different to other people. And I hold it back as much as I can, because what I really want to do is understand more about why they believe what they believe and try
Absolutely. It's endlessly fascinating to me. And it helps me understand to the point of what I'm trying to get to. And I was delighted in the last couple of months where I was introduced to the work of Jürgen Habermas, like to have a name for this idea of what he calls communicative action. This, like, how do we get to that point of action based on true mutual understanding and not simply the transmittal of information that's basically saying, do this or else. Like, that to me is deeply interesting. And yeah, when we're talking about identity, I remain deeply curious and like, well, how did you come to that? And why do you believe that? And not from how could you possibly believe that? But, and I talk about taking the stance in my book of, like, starting from the position. It's absolutely borrowed from unconditional positive regard, of start from the position of the person I'm talking to or thinking about or trying to figure out is smart, capable, and good. And at the very least, they want to be seen that way. And adding to that people operate over time according to their own internal logic. If you put those two things together, there must be a reason that whatever this behavior or this belief system that they are espousing and acting makes sense to them. What is that? Because for me, it illuminates at a whole bunch of different levels. Not only what's the whole mechanism of how people come to believe something in the first place, but how do people come to hold an opinion or a view on something that feels on the surface so wildly different from how I see the world? I keep coming to it. You don't have to get too far down before you're like, oh, okay, I see. I see where that's coming from. I may still not agree that those two things add up to that, but I now have a better understanding of where it's coming from. And yeah, I'm endlessly fascinated in just figuring that out. But The thing is when, and I love that identity, like all sorts of identity research that shows that. And I also feel like perhaps I like to sometimes describe myself as a starry-eyed realist. So perhaps too hopefully, I also believe that knowledge is power, and that the more people understand, for instance, some of the techniques that are often used against them, the more that they are at least aware of when they're being used, and they can choose whether or not to respond as intended or right.
I think the challenge, and again, I'm loving this back and forth. I think the challenge with that is that when I get knowledge over how I'm being manipulated, more often than not, confirmation bias, I go, yeah, you're right. In fact, every time I watch this news channel, they're trying to manipulate me. That's why I go to this news channel
because
where they're giving me the facts.
That's an excellent point. I just prefer this form of manipulation than this form of manipulation.
For me, when I go to identity, I like to categorize or organize three different ways. Right? And it's not exhaustive by any means, but it's perceived identity, desired identity, and social identity.
Okay.
And you've got like different things. You've got self-perception theory for the whole perceived identity. You've got social identity theory. But the point of it is that you've got these three different types of identities. So it's, I want to conform. I want, again, cognitive dissonance if what I'm doing or how I'm acting is counter to how I see the kind of person I am, or sometimes how I want to be perceived, or sometimes how my group is perceived.
Yes.
So if I feel that I'm acting differently to my group enough, therefore the ancient feeling of potentially being, thrown out. That's it. Thrown out of the group. I can't remember who said this, but it's like social death can sometimes feel worse than actual death, right? So it's the nature of that experience. So for me, one of the most important things, and I think part of the work that you do is you're looking for these, let's say, bedrock beliefs.
Yes.
You're looking for what is already true to the person.
Yes.
But at the same time, you're also, what you've just said there, which is you're also that, I mean, you again reference the notion, which isn't the same as unconditional positive regard, the Rogerian thing.
Yeah.
There's a great, one of my favorite books in the last few years is called How Minds Change by Dave McGraney. And in it, he talks about this notion of deep canvassing, which is this approach to work on political issues. And one of the most important elements of that was the deep respect that they gave to people who had a different point of view. So I turn up on your doorstep. I go, hey, what do you think of gay marriage? What do you think of this? And if the person says, oh, I don't agree with it, and you're canvassing for it, what you don't do is, well, you're wrong. Let me, as Adam Grant would say, logic bully you.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's, I think there's something to be said for that. Could you share a little bit from your perspective, Tamsen? What is it that you think this respect does psychologically at a deep level for the other person? How is it that allows them? Because I think part of it is connected to the identity.
Yes.
Because if I disrespect you, I'm saying you're a bad person. Yes. You're not worth listening to. You're a liar. You're lying to yourself. You're a sheep. Right. You're in all these words you're a deplorable.
Yeah.
When you demonstrate respect, what is going on there from your point of view?
So from my point of view, and I'm not a psychologist or cognitive science, I think there's a couple of things. One is you are validating that person as they are right now. Right? You're not asking them to be different than they are. And I think that when somebody shuts us down or says, no, you're wrong, or puts a label on us that doesn't feel right? Whether that is an accurate self-concept or whatever that we have of those different forms of identity. Again, we operate based on an internal logic. When someone gives one of those things to us, it's basically going, yeah, everything that you think about yourself and up to this point, wrong. So why would, if we're thinking about Cialdini and the principle of reciprocity, why would someone give you respect back? We are wired to kind of feed back to us what is given to us, because this backing and forthing, whether it's mirror neurons or whatever, is allowing us to get that deep-seated system one sense of capability and intent, to kind of paraphrase Susan Fisk's work, right? So are you qualified to talk to me about whatever this thing is? And why are you doing it? And so if you tell me I'm wrong without giving me any backing for me to believe what you are, I'm going to be like, who's this jackass? And what do you know about me? You don't know anything about me. How could you know possibly? That's getting at capability. And that sense of you're trying to ask me to be different than I am. I love Seth Godin's quote for this. He talks about asking fire to not be hot. It is it is absolutely unfathomable to people, like that they don't even know how to get from where you want them to be to someplace else. So I think that I heard it referenced one time as radical empathy too, just saying, I'm just gonna hold space for you and where you are and how you think. And I am, Stephen Covey style, gonna seek to understand where you're coming from before I do anything else. And I think it validates people. And I really think that it's like, I had a keynote that I used to give where I talked about those three things. Do I understand it? Do I agree with it? Does it validate what I've been doing and who I am so far? Like, those are really important criteria. But I would say the mechanism, for me, feels as close to that principle of reciprocity as something else. It's just, it basically says, from an intent standpoint, I intend to give you space and respect and be heard. Again, thanks to our wiring, a lot of times that means someone says, okay, well, you extended that to me. I'm going to extend that back.
I think there's also I love that answer. I think there's also from a neurochemical point of view. So whenever someone agrees with you, whenever someone shows you respect, there's an increase in empathy, which increases oxytocin.
Yeah.
Now, Paul Bloom in his book Against Empathy talked about how oxytocin brings people together, but also creates a divide between the other side and this whole polarized.
Yeah.
And if you think back in the tribal, past or ancient ancestors.
Yeah.
One of the things you had to do before anything else, and you kind of touch on this as well when you talk about, the source actually influences, so your credibility matters a lot, but it's like, is this person part of my tribe, is almost asked before anything that they say.
Oh, absolutely.
And so if they are part of my tribe, the empathy, the release of oxytocin, I trust, it's not seen as the trust hormone, I trust what they say without as much, let's say, of my critical faculty analyzing or challenging it. So once I see this person as part of my team, now all of a sudden I'll let them away with it. And when you respect someone, you're also stimulating the release of that oxytocin. You're validating them in such a way that they're not 100% sure that you're on their side, but they don't believe that you're not on their side, because normally people who are in the enemy camp would attack us like this.
Right.
And that's also why, if you look at Daryl Davis, the African-American that helped transform a lot of Ku Klux Klan members and got them to effectively leave the organization, because he showed up without judgment. He showed up friendly. He showed up with all of these things, which just seemed impossible to do. But once again, he's sort of giving them an experience whereby they're getting the predictive processing. Oh, this is not what I expect. But also he's giving them the respect to get them to feel this person is different. This person is it has similarities to me as well.
Yes.
Does that?
Yeah. Oh, so many things. Yes. So what that immediately reminds me of, I'm also, I think I already said, I love Fessinger's work. I'm deeply interested in cults and it's just mostly so I can draw a bright line and says, this is what cults do. And I am not doing any of that. But I remember watching a documentary on one recently where somebody said, you never think you're joining a cult. Like you never intend to join a cult. Everything makes sense to you at the time. And so I think that that's a really important thing too, is that no matter, I keep coming back to this internal logic. And I really think there is this, I keep playing with this phrase of the logic of belief, and that when we can create a belief-based argument, that's actually how we're operating. That is our theory in use, is a belief-based argument. We're tapping into those assumptions and beliefs and truths and experiences and intuitions and chemicals that are coming to us, and then in that split second and going, yes or no? Does it pass the gut check or not? This is now several times you've been talking about something that sparked where all my great hope lies. Not all of it, but when we come about the nature of the beliefs that can unite us rather than divide us, and that can, so much of what I try to do is try to say, okay, well, here's the friction point. Is there a way around it? And I don't know if that's just being, female and short, or for much of my career, I was the youngest person in the room. Now I'm no. But I've always tried to figure out, well, how do I just skip that friction point entirely? And thanks to school, I was reading this really fascinating article, a study that was done about, the concept in play is Construal level theory, which basically is talking about a kind of perceived psychological distance of a person, of a concept or something from you. And the general findings of the study were that the more somebody identified with the high construal, which is opposite of bedrock. I mean, it is a bedrock belief, so you can kind of think about it as one way or the other. Like those, the more that you could attach to something like everybody deserves a free and equal opportunity or a fair opportunity to succeed in this country, let's say that's a high construal phrase, then something that's very specific, let's say to a type of person, like that we need to support this kind of immigrant or this kind of refugee from something, like, right? You make it really specific, people are going to engage that identity because it creates that sense of otherness. But what they found was the more that you could create agreement and establish and bring forward, kind of kick forward out of system one into the attention, these high construal level things, to which I would also put in these basic axioms about how people are supposed to treat each other. And you talked about it with, oh, right, well, somebody who doesn't look like me usually is trying to attack me, is not operating this way. By you approaching me with respect, you are, I would suggest, tapping into one of those deeper seated beliefs about how we should interact with each other. And
it's implicit. It's an
implicit.
Assumption.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's not stated, but
it's not stated, but I think I believe
yeah.
that there's actually great power in stating some of those things, particularly with a resistant or skeptical audience. And I know a lot of times with sales and other things that there's that attempt to like create rapport based on like, oh, you're wearing black, I'm wearing black, or whatever. But I think that, and what I so far have seen has been wildly understudied, is that you can create not only that same kind of rapport by really starting with, well, I care about accomplishing this end, and I believe this and that. And I think that does a lot of that kind of, it basically expands the size of the in-group. To be, instead of being, I'm this identity, I'm this political party, I'm whatever, it expands the in-group to, I am somebody who believes
sure.
that people deserve a fair opportunity.
There's a couple of questions on this. First of all, that last thing that you're saying sounds very similar to, Cialdini's 7 principle of unity. It's expanding out the range. Challenge for you on this. So let's imagine, for example, you do state it. The potential problem I can foresee as happening is, as soon as you say something, as soon as somebody says something to me, I now start to doubt it. If someone turns to me, for example, years ago, I was hired by this company. This is when I was my first year in the summer in New York, and I was like 20 years old. And I was in this company I went in, and the guy said during the interview, just to let you know, this is not a pyramid scheme. And in that moment in time, I immediately knew.
There, you're like...
He actually said, he goes, this is not a pyramid scheme. He said, this is not a pyramid scheme. We have an office on Wall Street. And at that moment in time, I knew this was a pyramid scheme that had an office in Wall Street, right?
Yes.
So sometimes when we articulate the implicit, how do you ensure, because I totally understand what you're saying, I think it makes a lot of sense. How do you ensure that when you articulate the implicit, this is, we're both on the same side or whatever, how do you ensure when you do that, there's not that tendency of reactance of that whole fired up,
you're like, what? No. Okay.
Right.
So a couple things, and we were talking a little bit about this before we started recording as well, which is, the more that I am experimenting with this particular approach, the more I'm learning about how to get to that and what helps to avoid those things. And one is to state them positively, meaning frame them positively. So I had a woman I was working with one time who, she was, basically quoted the Rolling Stones and says, well, you can't always get what you want. I said, yes, but you're arguing for something. So what are you actually arguing for here? And by just switching it to, it sounds a little bit self-referential, but in the context, it made perfect sense for her, which is like, you can only achieve what's actually achievable, was gave somebody, like, now it directs the focus to, okay, what can we actually achieve? Right? Versus what do I want? Why can't I get it? And whatever. Just saying, well, it kind of runs an end run around that objection. But it also it avoids creating that vacuum of a negative statement. And one of the things that I don't think we've talked about yet, but I moonlighted for 13 years as a Weight Watchers leader. And this idea of never leave a vacuum is really important. Like, always fill the space, whether it's a habit space or something else. And they don't have to necessarily accept it, but if you leave it open, well, stop doing this. Well, they don't know what to do, right? Like, and anybody with a dog who's, trained it in the last 5 years knows that that's kind of like where dog training is now too, is you can't just tell a dog to stop something. You actually need to say, do this instead, because it's like, I don't know what to do. So one thing I would say is frame it positively. And this is another thing where, again, future line of research is what is this, what constitutes this band of fairly reliable beliefs that we can anchor messages in? And to some extent, it depends, as all things do, on who you're talking to, how much you already share experiences, mindset, etc. I'd say the more different you are, the more axiomatic, the more basic principle you have to get to in order to ensure at least understandability, if not agreeability in that context. So for instance, if this is one of my favorite examples. So I have a TEDx speaker that I was working with. He's a neuroscientist, and he's basically has like a grand theory for why the brain is the way that it does, like what it is. But he got to it by asking a very interesting question, which was, what is it about the computational brain, a computational system of the brain that requires sleep? Because, and this is one of those like drop a fact that like you can't unhear. He's like, there's literally no survivable injury or intervention that allows a human to go without sleep. Like you cannot, like, so there is something so fundamental to what sleep does to us that it's something. And he was frustrated by the fact that most people were focusing on what happens during sleep, but his question was, why sleep? And he's come to his hypothesis is, and this is how he first said it, well, it's the homeostatic regulation of criticality in the brain. Now, if he's talking to other neuroscientists, that's totally fine, because they're going to understand why homeostatic regulation would be necessary. Okay, we're trying to keep this necessary, and why criticality would be necessary. I am sure that most people have no idea what I'm talking about. And yet that's part of my job, working with these speakers for TEDx New England, is to say, okay, I may know what you're talking about, but what do you really mean? Like, let's fundamentally, what is the baseline concept that is represented or you're talking about with homeostatic regulation? And he said, well, it's like a thermostat. And I'm like, okay, so we're talking about maintenance. We're talking about maintenance of a condition. Yes. All right, so what's criticality? He's like, well, if it's, think about it to, maintenance of a condition for any system, there's like an optimum set point. And in that, the name of that is criticality. So we could explain it both from a metaphorical standpoint. And one of the things that I often talk about with my clients is you can't stop at the metaphor, because we can interpret metaphors differently. We have to say it's like a thermostat that's maintaining the optimal temperature.
Sure. Right?
So we have to actually say, like, it's the maintenance and it's the set point. So what I have seen to be true so far is that the more basic, the more foundational, the more truly axiomatic in a physical science, mathematical principle way that we can describe something, the more likely it is to not trigger reactance from somebody. But I'm also curious, again, I don't have time to look at it right now, but there are sets of fairly universal cultural beliefs as well. And I have a feeling that if we were to get to those a little faster, we're not just saying, well, I'm not this. We're saying it's a forward belief. And one of the ways I think to also frame that is, I am owning it. I am saying, I believe that this is important. And I believe that because this is important, this is the approach that makes sense. And so it comes back to that concept of respect, which is, I'm not asking you to believe it too. I'm just telling you what I believe. And this is one of those places where, thinking about that difference between kind of, I'm talking to you because I'm really, really just trying to get you to do something versus I need to step away and accept the fact that I may not get the desired action out of this, but establishing mutual understanding is in fact the goal. And if it's there, and if there's agreement, then what will happen is internally inspired action. That's where that ends up being a pretty big mind shift for some people, but B, I think it is a deeply respectful position to take of the other person, to basically say, I'm going to tell you why this makes sense to me based on what I believe, based on what I see. I may bring in evidence to support the facts that I have that support these beliefs. And then let's have a conversation about that, so that I can get an understanding of if there's friction or disagreement, where is it? And is that resolvable? Some of them aren't, at least not quickly. Like that's the great work of J.R. Clifton and Primal Beliefs. Oh my God, I love that research. But I think there is a much bigger band of alignment than we currently tap into.
So with that in mind, and look, I know we've just a few minutes left, so I've just a couple more things, if that's okay.
Oh gosh,
okay,
yes,
great.
Of course.
So first of all, my favorite neuroscientist is Lisa Feldman Barrett.
Oh my gosh. Yes, she was almost, she actually, not the year that I was there, but she did a TEDx Cambridge talk. So
wow.
Yeah.
So in her concept, again, very much aligned with the person that you were working with, her concept is she uses the concept of a body budget.
Yeah.
So we are regulating the body budget, kind of very similar, and it's perfectly aligned. And I think she's one of the best, most successful proponents of a metaphor that captures quite complex ideas.
Yeah.
And it goes pretty much counter to the natural sort of triune brain theory that we have at the moment. So I think she's a phenomenal example of that. Something else you mentioned earlier was you mentioned about pain, and you were sort of wondering or pondering around my perspective on pain in terms of cognitive dissonance is one thing that shifts us, but again, what about pain long term? And it's related to what we're talking about at the moment, but it's, for me, pain itself as a motivation is great, but it speaks back to what you just mentioned. I think the missing part of pain isn't that pain doesn't work or can't work long term. It can. The problem is it doesn't point you in the right direction. So with pain, you might be motivated, but you're not motivated to, you're motivated from. And if you're not motivated to your point, you don't have a specific goal in mind. Therefore, you might stop injecting heroin, but that might mean you take crack instead, right? So the problem with pain is the lack of direction that we have. Now, I just want to pivot for a moment into asking you about, and we'll just have three more questions in the quick fire round. So the first one is the weaponization of language. What we're talking about here is we find bedrock beliefs, things that we have to share in common with people. We use logic and reasoning, and we tell stories and all sorts of stuff, but we're kind of assuming positive intent on all different agencies. The challenge is, if you turn on the news or social media or you walk outside your door, there is literally a proliferation of weaponized words everywhere. Even the way I'm talking is a lot more hyperbole than I would have talked a few years ago, because we're being trained and everything is over the top, right? And it's partly about living in America. If you're in, certain parts of Europe, they don't talk as extreme as we do here. But it's also the words. It's the way they're described. The one-liners or the messages from a message design point of view. I want to ask you about this. What is your thoughts around how language is used, both for nefarious purposes and also how we need to tackle that when we're trying to promote messages that enhance the quality of people's lives? Yeah.
So just a minor, small question then, Owen, just not an important one at all. All right, big question. I wrestle with this all the time. No pressure. No, I'm just going to solve it. Okay. First thing I would point to is one of my favorite quotes. It's the epigraph at the front of Find Your Red Thread, which is Agatha Christie from the ABC Murders, where she, through Hercule Poirot, says that words are only the outer clothing of ideas. So that, to me, that is, I come back and back and back and back and back to that phrase, because first of all, I agree. So let me make that clear. But when there's language that's weaponized, like part of, again, I know it's starry-eyed. I'm still hoping it's realist that says the more people understand that the words are an abstraction of something else, and that you push to say, well, no, what do you mean by that? That we don't accept everything at face value all the time, and that at a moment where we do feel like we should take something at face value, sometimes should be a flag not to. It's been for a long time a personal mantra that I say to myself, which is disconfirm what I believe to be true. Disconfirm what you believe to be true. Look for where you might be wrong. Look for the dissenting opinion. Because
think again, as Adam Grant would put it.
Yeah, exactly. Because I can't possibly know everything. And so it satisfies like my inner nerd of like learning more. But B, it also keeps me out of that trap of thinking I know best and imparting that to somebody else, because I may not. And I very much subscribe to Gardner's multiple intelligences. It was definitely a lesson taught to me as moonlighting as a Weight Watcher leader, is that everybody is smart about something in some way and smarter than I am in that thing. And at the very least, a fun game I can play with myself is, how is this person smarter than me? All the time.
It's very easy. When I play that game with people, I do really well. I could find that.
Again, I'm not starting it from like, I'm super high, raise this. But I mean, it's just like, I'm deeply curious about people. Okay. So the first thing is pushing back and helping. It's part of the reason why I established the Message Design Institute, and where I where we typically think about messages is like the marketing, the branding, the tagline piece of it. Really trying to position that for people as that's a third stage, right? Like that's a stage that's primarily engaged in attention getting, right? And there are at least two other major stages that come before that. One is making whatever they're saying understandable. And then the other is making it agreeable to some aspect of who you are and how you're making decisions. And so the more that I think people can understand that, to quote The Princess Bride, you keep using that word and I don't think it means what you think it means, or at the very least, I don't think it means what you think it means. Let's have a conversation. It has a multi-pronged benefit in my mind. One, creates that respect. Two, I'm actually going to learn from you about how it is that you think about something. Three, that it helps us understand a little bit more where we do overlap. And I have to say, one of the most fascinating pieces of this work that I've been doing as I've been kind of working it through with clients is taking a word that has lost its meaning, but is still very important to somebody. Let's say something like authenticity. It has so many individual meanings that when someone's like, well, my idea is this, be authentic. And I'm like, you gotta define it. And asking them to define it in their own terms. What do you mean by authenticity? It is an endlessly fascinating process. Not because it is where I've discovered more than anything else that our point of view is the only truly unique thing that we have. Meaning how all of these beliefs and experiences and feelings and whatever come together is 100% unique. We may share elements with that, but being able to go, oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way. Or, I can see why you think about it that way. I think about it slightly differently, but it's an interesting thing. It helps us understand that any time that we capture something in words, we are lopping off several other layers of truth establishment, right? Back to what we're talking about at the beginning. And the reason why I keep doing this is because my mental model that I love is the Ways of Knowing model by John Heron and Reason. And I love that. Really spoke to me because at this bottom level is this experiential, like what does it actually feel like to like be here, and what's the temperature, and what's the emotions that I'm feeling. And then there is this metaphorical layer where music and art and nonverbal expressions can be. But it's like, it's my best next step at getting you to understand what it feels like to be here. And if I can't put you in there, I can try to show you, or I can try to describe it and say it's like a thermostat. And then there's this propositional layer where the actual words come into play. Mm-hmm. And so to me, the more that we can understand that those words sit up and that they feel so concrete, but they're actually a third layer at least of abstraction. I personally think there's an extra layer in there, but they're at least at the third layer of abstraction from what somebody actually is experiencing, I think helps us, potentially gives us a tool for stepping back just a moment and saying what perhaps is really going on here.
That reminds me a lot of the field of general semantics and Alfred Korzybski. He's the famous quote, "The map is not the territory."
Yes.
And there was I talk about it sometimes. There's this type of language called E prime, which was invented in the 1940s by a guy called David Berland, but it was based upon Korzybski's work. And in a nutshell, it's English without the verb to be. So you have to index things. So you can't say this is a table. You have to say this seems like a table for me. And similar to what you've just been saying, it's about a reminder of the whole Plato's cave to a degree, but it's the whole what you see is not necessarily what is. You get into the quantum physics, you realize this table is not actually solid. We act as if it's solid, but actually it's made up of all these. All of this.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
So we're wrong constantly. It's about the recognition of that, which I think is wonderful and aligns very much. I want to just pivot on to two final questions I have for you, and then we'll quick fire in. The second last one is logic, reason.
Yes.
In one of the things that I've seen you do, and I know this is kind of touched on in both books, but not necessarily in either book specifically where you dive into it, but you have your model. You have what you call a core question, right? You have a core claim. You have a core case. You have your bedrock beliefs. You have your essential elements. And in a nutshell, you have a nice structure. And just to give people an idea of it, the core question is fundamentally what is the question you're trying to answer? What is it that you're looking to?
Yeah, it's the person. Generally I'm thinking about this in terms of having a conversation or presenting information to somebody else. So it's the question that the person you're talking to actively and knowingly has right now that you believe your approach answers.
And to see if I'm correct, so the bedrock beliefs are the things that you both will agree with, the both beliefs that you both agree.
I mean, the structure is fundamentally an Aristotelian syllogism. It is basically premise plus premise equals conclusion.
So here's where my question is.
Yeah.
From an emotion point of view.
Yes.
Where does emotion, because I know that you also recognize, you talked about identity in your new book. You talk in different areas about the importance of story, the importance of emotion.
Yeah.
So in that, it did seem like it is very structured it's wonderful, but it's very structured from a logical point of view.
Yep.
How do you fit in the importance of emotion in that? Or do you say, look, this is important, but this is how to logically, and then there's a separate, like how does emotion and logic fit into this area?
Yeah. So there's a couple of places where I've come to appreciate what I see as a finer line of difference between certain things. So I think, for instance, we interchange logic and rationality a lot, and I do not believe they're the same thing. And second, I think particularly when it comes to the operation of the brain, I think we interchange emotional and intuitive or system one all the time too. And I also don't think that those are the same thing. So I'm not denying the role or importance of emotions. Emotions, that's one of like Bandura's 4 conditions for somebody believing they can do something is actually their emotional state at the moment. There's all the classic like hungry, angry, lonely, tired types of things that affect all the processing of everything else. By the way, comes back to criticality of the brain. What I have observed and what I felt, part of this has been like a lifelong, it was a 17-year journey with a fairly severe panic disorder from the age of 17 to 34, having to take a real hard look at about my emotions and those feelings and where they came from and when they were and were not logically prompted and things like that. So here's where I think it comes into play. That they are part of the soup into which out of which the system one is, our fast brains are delivering gut checks, information, tests, telling us what to do, because I think what we feel in the moment shuts down, opens up not only different aspects of what we can access in the moment, but it may, in certain cases, actually shut down our access to our rational thinking brain, which is where I get really suspicious of people who actively try to activate pain, like they introduce pain, they introduce fear, they introduce feelings of shame, et cetera, because it literally like is shutting down somebody's ability to make a judgment. But I am very much thanks to my panic disorder, very much a believer in cognitive behavioral therapy, and that our feelings, many of them, not all of them, are a product of our thoughts. Particularly our sustained feelings are products of our thought. And that a lot of the feelings that keep people from changing, that keep people from doing things, are ones that a lot of times can be reset with a reset of the perspective that we're taking on it. So I think that they're present, but I do believe that we can create a kind of a logical structure for in the moment, creating a proxy for what is the soup of things in my system one brain delivering to me in the moment. Yeah.
So it's an awareness of that and a recognition of the impact that can have. Because I know sometimes you have someone who feels very strongly like an expert, that has a very strong point of view, great reasoning. So the emotion isn't affecting their reasoning, but it is dictating the direction of their reasoning.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And the same is true of ourselves.
100%. Yeah.
So,
but what I have found is, this is, I am deeply interested and informed by the development of dual process theory and all of that, because what is, just as an example, one of the things that really helped me get past my panic disorder was a technique that I developed in the moment, which was based on a logical piece of information. It was a penny drop moment, where I read that you cannot be physically relaxed and mentally anxious at the same time. And so any moment where I was starting to feel like panic coming up, I would start to, instead of trying to go stop panicking, brain, or like somehow remove the feeling, I would literally physically relax every part of my body to have that happen. There's also research that shows this. I'm not sure where to point people to, but that shows, I've also heard someone say you can't be curious and furious at the same time. One of the fastest ways to reopen a shut down frontal cortex is to ask a question. It flips people back into a more rational state by opening up that curiosity gap. And
I'd say it depends on the question, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, why are you acting that way?
Why are you such an idiot?
Yes, it's not the kind of question. Thank you.
My brain is more logical now.
Yeah,
Thank you for asking.
Sorry. Yes, sorry. About which one they're curious.
Yeah.
Really important point. That's what I keep coming back to, is that it is. And I have to bracket out my own experience, my own bias on that, and say, listen, I'm aware that I'm coming in with those observed beliefs from my own experience, but they've also been confirmed, even when I have tried to disconfirm them, with my observation in the Weight Watcher meeting room and what I've done in my career for building messages for markets and for businesses and for individuals, that it's not that the emotion doesn't matter, but it doesn't need to remain dominant.
Get you. Yeah, makes sense. Very last question, and then the quick fire in. Say what they can't unhear in a nutshell, in a sentence or two. How would you describe, who's it for, and what makes it different to finding your red thread?
So the biggest difference between it and the red thread is that it is very much what we're talking about, the principles behind all the things that we've been talking about today. So they are a collection of kind of the 9 mantras, phrases that I've come up with over the years to really capture my own perspective and point of view about why and how it's possible to reach this kind of mutual understanding in an explicit, non-coercive, non-manipulative way, and to create a situation where you're not just driving action, but sustainable change. It's, one of the things we said earlier, it's about inspiring internally motivated action. So it's basically taking all of these things that we've been talking about and kind of boiling them down to the ones that I think are the most useful day to day for folks that want to be able to get people on board with an idea, and they want to do it what feels to them like the right way, or a different way or a better way, and to give them kind of easy hooks for remembering how to do that.
And we've touched on a number of those today. Let me just tell everybody, if you have any interest in this area, which if you're listening at this point in time and you're still here, if you're still alive, let me reach out. Both these books, I mean, Say What You Can't Unhear is an award-winning book, phenomenal book. Finding a Red Thread, phenomenal book. So highly, if it's not already obvious, recommending Tamsen's work. Quick fire round. Favorite movie?
Oh, The Thin Man with Myrna Loy and William Powell. Yeah.
Favorite? It can be instead of the favorite movie if you need to. Favorite TV show?
Top of mind for whatever reason was The Good Place.
Favorite musician?
Matthew Perryman Jones.
Favorite artist?
Speaking to me today is Tamara de Lempicka.
Favorite philosopher?
I got to go with Aristotle, my boy.
Yeah, of course. If you could live anywhere else besides where you live, where would you live?
The Cornish coast.
If you could do anything else besides what you're doing, what would you do?
Personal stylist.
Where would you travel in time, past, present, future?
Gosh, that's a good one. I would probably, I don't like what happened in the past. I'd go future once we figured it all out.
What super skill would you have?
Anti-staining.
Anti-staining, great. It's the most practical answer I've ever heard on the podcast. Other people are like invisible. And you're like, I just don't want to stain.
I just don't want to stain things.
That's right.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
And final question, in a nutshell, what is one sentence, the whole billboard question, if you could put one sentence on a billboard, one sentence in a message for the whole world to hear, what would it be?
I'm going to quote Baz Luhrmann and the other competition for favorite movie, that a life lived in fear is a life half lived.
Fantastic. Wonderful. And that's, I want to start singing now. Big thank you.
My pleasure.
Really, really enjoyed our chat.
Same.
Loved it. It was great. So thanks very much and best of luck with everything. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. I hope you found this as fascinating as I did. This was one of my most fun interviews ever. And this is also where we say goodbye to the season. We will be returning in a few weeks or at least a month or two, for the next season of the Change Your Minds podcast. But for now, thanks very much again to Tamsen. Take care, be well. And as always, may the force be with you. Bye for now.